In June 1941, Admiral Karl Donitz stood on the peninsula of Karaman in Lorient, watching Fritz Todt hand him the original architectural plans for what would become the largest submarine base outside German territory. The concrete fortress behind them had been completed in just 3 months, 14 cells capable of servicing 20 U-boats simultaneously, with walls thick enough to withstand any bomb the Allies could drop. Donitz believed these bases would make his submarines invincible, that the French Atlantic coast would become an impregnable launching point for the strangulation of Britain. He had no idea that within 4 years, every one of these fortresses would stand empty, monuments to a submarine fleet hunted to extinction despite the protection of the most sophisticated military infrastructure Nazi Germany ever built. The clash between Donitz's concrete fortresses and Allied counter-strategy represents a fundamental conflict in military thinking. The belief that defensive infrastructure can compensate for tactical and technological inferiority versus the reality that wars are won by breaking codes, developing superior technology, and overwhelming industrial production. Donitz built fortresses. The Allies built intelligence networks, radar systems, and merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The bases survived. The submarines didn't. To understand what American soldiers discovered when they finally reached these bases in 1945, you need to understand what made them so extraordinary. These weren't simple harbor installations. They were revolutionary engineering projects that combined cutting-edge construction techniques with operational efficiency that allowed Germany to prosecute submarine warfare on an unprecedented scale. The construction process began with a technique borrowed from World War I submarine pens at Bruges. Engineers built massive dikes around the construction site, then pumped out the water completely. This allowed workers to build in dry conditions, dramatically accelerating construction timelines. While the site was dry, teams constructed dense steel skeletons, one iron reinforcement rod every 10 centimeters, creating a mesh so tight that the resulting concrete would be nearly impenetrable. These skeletons were then boxed with wooden forms and filled with specially treated concrete designed to cure harder than standard military-grade material. The concrete wasn't just poured, it was engineered. Chemical additives modified its composition to increase compression resistance and reduce vulnerability to explosive shock. Each cubic meter of this concrete could withstand pressures that would shatter conventional building materials. Once the supporting walls reached full height, massive cranes positioned giant metal frames that would become the roof structure. These frames were then sealed and cemented in 3 distinct layers, each serving a specific defensive purpose. The innovation wasn't just in thickness, though 3 meters of reinforced concrete is formidable, but in the layered design that distributed explosive force across multiple structural elements. When construction reached completion, workers demolished the dikes, water rushed back into the cells, and the base became operational. The entire process from breaking ground to operational status took approximately 3 months for the initial cells at Saint-Nazaire. This was revolutionary speed for structures of this magnitude. The bases weren't just protective shells. They were complete operational facilities designed to maximize submarine efficiency. Each cell contained systems that would allow a U-boat to go from battle-damaged and depleted to fully armed and refueled in days rather than weeks. Fuel systems were particularly sophisticated. 3 levels below ground, massive steel tanks stretched from floor to ceiling. At Saint-Nazaire, these tanks held enough diesel to send a submarine to the American coast and back without refueling. The distribution system used pumps connected to pipes that ran through the base structure, allowing simultaneous refueling of multiple submarines. Workers could fill a U-boat's tanks in hours, not days. Even now, 80 years later, you can still smell diesel in these underground chambers. Electrical systems were equally advanced. Transformer rooms contained equipment capable of switching between multiple voltage standards, 220 and 380 volts, and could accommodate both French and German devices. This meant technicians could use whatever tools were available without worrying about compatibility. Large electrical boards with labeled connection points, Motor 1, Motor 2, distributed power throughout the facility. Every cell had access to compressed air systems, fresh water, and communications equipment. The torpedo loading systems represented peak efficiency. Overhead, cranes could lift torpedoes from storage magazines and position them for loading in minutes. Each submarine carried approximately 14 torpedoes depending on the model. A well-trained crew could reload a submarine's entire torpedo complement in less than a day. This rapid turnaround meant submarines spent maximum time hunting convoys and minimum time in port. Repair facilities occupied entire sections of each base. Machine shops contained lathes, presses, welding equipment, and precision tools for fixing everything from periscope optics to diesel engine components. Damaged submarines that would normally require weeks in a shipyard could be repaired and returned to service in days. The bases essentially functioned as complete naval arsenals, eliminating the need to return to German ports for anything except catastrophic damage. The workforce required to build these installations was staggering. Thousands of laborers came from across occupied Europe, drawn by wages equivalent to German industrial workers, substantially higher than typical French salaries at the time. The TOT organization run by Fritz Todt coordinated this massive labor mobilization. They offered bonus systems that included hazard pay for bombing risk, housing allowances, and other incentives that made submarine base construction among the most lucrative jobs available in occupied France. Not all workers came voluntarily. The Vichy government supplied forced laborers, North African workers, and Spanish Republicans imprisoned after fleeing Franco's regime. These workers received subsistence wages and were exploited ruthlessly, treated as expendable resources in the rush to complete construction. Later, hundreds of specialized technicians arrived to operate the completed facilities, creating a permanent workforce of maintenance crews, refueling specialists, electrical engineers, and weapons technicians. The strategic value of these bases transformed German submarine operations. Before capturing French ports, U-boats operating from Germany had to transit through the North Sea and around Scotland to reach Atlantic hunting grounds. This journey consumed days and exposed submarines to British patrols in confined waters. The round trip to operational areas and back could take weeks, dramatically reducing the time submarines spent actually hunting convoys. The French bases changed everything. Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux sat directly on the Atlantic, cutting transit time by more than half. A submarine could leave Lorient, reach the mid-Atlantic gap within days, patrol for weeks, and return for resupply while a submarine operating from Germany was still in transit. The operational efficiency multiplier was enormous. The same number of submarines could maintain continuous pressure on Allied convoys because they spent so much more time in their hunting grounds. Donitz understood this advantage perfectly. When he inspected the French ports in June 1940, immediately after the armistice, he saw not just harbors but the infrastructure for winning the Battle of the Atlantic. He moved quickly to establish operational bases, taking over civilian buildings in Lorient to house his staff while construction of the fortified bunkers began. He set up his command post in 3 middle-class houses on the Karaman Peninsula, where he could watch submarines come and go while planning operations from a converted bar decorated with Kriegsmarine clocks and coffee tables adorned with tiles showing submarine emblems. His orders to commanders arriving at French bases were unambiguous. An immense coastal arc is now at our disposal. It is an incomparable advantage for the war effort against merchant ships. This is our chance. It must be seized as soon as possible. I will not tolerate weakness. Attack without letting go. Do not give an inch. What we take, we keep. Advance through attack. The commanders followed these orders with devastating effect. The period from 1940 to early 1943 became known as the happy time for German submariners. Wolfpack tactics, coordinated from Donitz's headquarters and enabled by the French base's operational efficiency, tore through Allied convoys. Ace commanders like Otto Kretschmer, Gunther Prien, and Joachim Schepke competed for kills, their submarines returning to Lorient flying pennants showing tonnage sunk. Kretschmer alone torpedoed 56 Allied ships, a record that would never be broken. The bases facilitated this slaughter. Submarines would depart Lorient loaded with torpedoes and fuel, hunt until their weapons were expended or damage forced return, then slip back into the concrete cells for rapid turnaround. The protection offered by the bunkers meant submarines could be serviced even during Allied air raids. Bombs might devastate the surrounding city, but inside the cells, work continued uninterrupted. This is what made the bases so strategically valuable, not just protection, but the operational tempo they enabled. Germany's relatively small submarine fleet could maintain pressure far beyond what their numbers suggested because the bases allowed such rapid turnaround. A submarine might spend 2 weeks at sea, 3 days in port, then 2 more weeks hunting. This cycle meant a larger percentage of Germany's submarine force was operational at any given time. But defensive infrastructure, no matter how impressive, cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. And by 1941, the Allies were developing the countermeasures that would ultimately make these fortresses irrelevant. At Liverpool, in basement rooms beneath Derby House in Exchange Flag Square, the Royal Navy established Western Approaches Command. This facility became the nerve center for all Allied convoy operations in the Atlantic. 300 personnel, 80% of them women aged 17 to 19, worked around the clock coordinating convoy routing, escort assignments, and intelligence analysis. The Navy managed shipping while the Royal Air Force coordinated air coverage, a combined headquarters that allowed unprecedented coordination between services. The physical layout of Western Approaches Command reflected its purpose. Large plotting tables showed real-time positions of convoys and known U-boat locations. Communication stations maintained constant contact with ships at sea and coastal reconnaissance aircraft. Intelligence analysts processed information from multiple sources, creating a comprehensive picture of Atlantic operations that no single ship or even fleet commander could possess. This centralized command structure gave the Allies a decisive advantage. Instead of individual convoy commodores making independent decisions based on limited information, routing decisions were made by commanders who could see the entire Atlantic theater. When intelligence indicated U-boat concentrations in particular areas, convoys could be routed around them. When submarines were detected, escorts could be vectored to intercept. The bases gave Germany operational efficiency. Liverpool gave the Allies strategic coordination. But coordination required information, and this is where the real battle was won. The submarine bases had an inherent vulnerability that would prove fatal. They required constant radio communication to be effective. Donitz's Wolfpack tactics depended on submarines reporting convoy sightings, so headquarters could vector other boats to intercept. The coordination that made Wolfpacks so deadly required submarines to break radio silence regularly. Every transmission was encrypted using Enigma machines, devices the Germans believed produced unbreakable codes. This confidence was so complete that when convoys began evading Wolfpacks with impossible accuracy, German intelligence concluded the Allies must have developed revolutionary radar technology. They never suspected their codes had been broken. At Bletchley Park in the English countryside, Alan Turing and his team achieved what German cryptographers thought impossible. By June 1941, they were reading German naval communications almost in real time. Every order from Donitz's headquarters to submarines at sea was intercepted and decoded. Every submarine reporting a convoy sighting gave away its position. Every coordination of Wolfpack attacks revealed the concentration point where U-boats would gather. The intelligence advantage was total. The Germans were fighting blind while the Allies could read their every move. But the British were careful never to act so obviously that the Germans would realize Enigma had been compromised. Convoys would be routed around Wolfpacks, but not so precisely that it seemed impossible. Aircraft would happen to patrol areas where submarines were known to be operating. The deception was so complete that Germany never changed their encryption system. This intelligence was supplemented by another critical source: French resistance networks operating around the submarine bases. The bases required thousands of workers to function, and not all of them were loyal to Germany. Resistance networks deliberately infiltrated personnel into base operations, offering their services to Germans while secretly gathering intelligence for the Allies. In Lorient, a maritime engineer named Jacques Stosskopf became one of the most effective spies of World War II. He was Alsatian, spoke fluent German, and presented himself as the perfect collaborator. The Germans trusted him so completely they made him deputy director of the Karaman arsenal. one of the most sensitive positions in the entire submarine base system. From this position, Stoskov had access to every detail of submarine operations. His method was remarkable. Endowed with extraordinary memory, he would simply observe everything during his workday, then recite it all from memory to his resistance contact. Which submarines departed when they left, which commanders were aboard, what armament they carried, how long they'd be at sea. This information flowed through the Alliance resistance network to British intelligence, where it supplemented the Enigma decrypts with concrete operational details. Stoskov maintained his cover for years. Submariners would drink in Lorient bars, frustrated about upcoming patrols, and drop details about where they were going and what they expected to encounter. Resistance operatives collected this intelligence and passed it along. When maintenance crews prepared submarines for departure, observers noted the preparations and reported to resistance networks. When fanfare began playing at the base, intelligence networks knew a submarine would depart within the hour. The Germans never realized how thoroughly compromised their operations had become. They thought their bases were secure fortresses when they were actually intelligence sieves. Every operational detail was being collected, analyzed, and used against them. But intelligence alone couldn't sink submarines. For that, the Allies needed technological superiority and industrial capacity. And by 1943, both were tilting decisively in their favor. Surface radar improved dramatically. Early war radar could barely detect submarines on the surface at night. By 1943, centimetric radar could spot a surfaced U-boat from miles away, giving escorts time to intercept before the submarine could attack or dive. Submarines that surfaced to charge batteries or transit to patrol areas became vulnerable targets. Sonar technology also advanced. ASDIC systems became more sensitive and more reliable at tracking submerged submarines. The effective range increased, allowing escorts to maintain contact with U-boats through evasive maneuvers. Depth charge patterns became more effective as sonar provided better tracking data. Most critically, long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap. Early in the war, convoys crossing the Atlantic had air cover for the first few hundred miles from Britain or America, then entered a vast area where no land-based aircraft could reach them. This gap was where wolf packs concentrated, knowing convoys had only surface escorts for protection. New bomber models, particularly the B-24 Liberator configured for maritime patrol, had the range to cover the entire Atlantic. By late 1943, convoys could have air cover throughout their journey, and aircraft were devastatingly effective against submarines. A U-boat spotted on the surface by an aircraft had seconds to crash dive before bombs or depth charges arrived. Many submarines never made it below the surface. Escort carriers, merchant ships converted to carry aircraft, extended air coverage even further. These small carriers traveled with convoys, providing dedicated air patrol that could respond immediately to submarine threats. A submarine trying to track a convoy would find aircraft overhead within minutes of being spotted. The technological shift was comprehensive. Submarines that had been predators in 1941 were prey by 1943, and the bases couldn't protect submarines at sea. The industrial dimension was equally decisive. Donitz's strategy of tonnage warfare, sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, required sustained submarine effectiveness. For 2 years, it worked. Monthly sinking rates exceeded new ship construction. Britain's food reserves dwindled. The tonnage war was being won. Then American industry fully mobilized. Henry Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding with prefabrication techniques and assembly line methods. Liberty ships that previously took months to build were now being launched in weeks. At peak production, American shipyards completed multiple merchant ships per day. The tonnage balance shifted dramatically. By 1943, new ship construction was exceeding sinking rates, even during intensive U-boat campaigns. Germany couldn't match this production. Their arsenals were launching a new U-boat every 3 days, impressive by any standard. But submarines took trained crews and required constant maintenance. Each U-boat sunk was not just a lost vessel, but a lost crew of 50 men who'd received months of specialized training. The Allies could replace merchant ships faster than Germany could replace submarines and their crews. The strategic mathematics became unsustainable. Each month, Donitz needed to sink more tonnage than the Allies were building, while simultaneously maintaining his submarine fleet strength against increasing losses. By early 1943, both metrics were moving in the wrong direction. Sinking rates were declining as convoys became better defended. Submarine losses were increasing as Allied detection and weapons improved. The tonnage war was being lost. May 1943 marked the breaking point. That month, Dönitz lost 41 submarines, half his operational Atlantic force gone in 30 days. The losses weren't sustainable. Submarine crews were being killed faster than training schools could replace them. The wolf packs that had terrorized convoys were being hunted to extinction. The bases themselves became targets for sustained bombing campaigns. The RAF dropped 27,000 tons of bombs on Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and the other submarine ports. The attacks were devastating for the surrounding cities. Hundreds of civilians died. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Workshop buildings around the bases were destroyed, but the bases themselves, those massive concrete fortresses, remained operational. The three-layer concrete roofs absorbed hit after hit. Bombs that should have penetrated simply cratered the outer layer. German engineers had even developed the Fangrost system, parallel beams separated by explosion chambers designed to crumble under bomb impact, dissipating energy before it reached lower protective layers. When a bomb hit, the beam section would break and shower powder, but the underlying structure remained intact. Churchill and his commanders faced a frustrating reality. The bases were effectively unbombable with existing weapons. Raids that devastated cities around them left the submarine pens untouched. At Western Approach's command, the decision was made to abandon strategic bombing of the bases themselves. As one British officer noted, the roofs were so thick they were essentially impregnable. Better to focus resources on sinking U-boats in the Atlantic and bombing German production facilities than waste ordnance trying to crack concrete fortresses. This decision confirmed what the bases represented: magnificent engineering in service of a losing strategy. The fortresses could withstand any attack, but they couldn't make submarines survive at sea. The British did attempt one spectacular raid against the bases. In March 1942, British commandos launched Operation Chariot against Saint-Nazaire. The target wasn't the submarine base itself, but the Joubert Lock, the only dry dock on the French Atlantic coast large enough to service the Tirpitz, Germany's largest battleship. If the Tirpitz joined the U-boats in the Atlantic, it could devastate convoys. 611 British soldiers attacked by sea, assaulting a port defended by 4,000 German troops. The raid was a bloodbath. Germans positioned on the submarine base roof poured fire into the landing parties. 170 British soldiers were killed, 200 captured. But the mission succeeded. HMS Campbelltown, loaded with 5 tons of explosives, rammed into the Joubert Lock and detonated the next day, destroying the only dock capable of servicing the Tirpitz. The battleship never entered the Atlantic. The raid demonstrated both the base's defensive strength and their irrelevance. The commandos threw themselves into defended positions and took horrible casualties, but they achieved their objective by attacking infrastructure adjacent to the base, not the base itself. The submarine pens remained untouched and operational. They just didn't matter strategically anymore. By late 1943, the bases were servicing a dying submarine fleet. Average submarine survival dropped below 3 patrols. Crews faced an 85% chance of dying in service. The submarines that did return came back damaged, their crews traumatized by constant air attacks and depth-charge barrages. German submariners understood their fate. Diaries recovered from captured U-boats describe men resigned to death, going through patrol routines while waiting for the inevitable attack. One German officer wrote in his diary about the hopeless situation his troops faced in Thuringia as American forces advanced. There is no leadership, no longer any solidarity. The tanks push back everything in front of them. Since they cannot be combated with trucks, tanks, or heavy weapons, the will to resist is non-existent. Our troops are wandering around like rabbits. There is no point in carrying our gear and our weapons around. The situation is hopeless. We can only abandon ourselves to our fate. This same sense of futility pervaded the submarine service by 1944. The bases couldn't protect them once they left port. Allied technology had surpassed German defenses. American production had made the tonnage war unwinnable. The intelligence advantage was total. Submarines went to sea knowing most would never return, because Dönitz ordered them to, because the Reich demanded it, because surrendering meant admitting that years of war had been for nothing. After D-Day in June 1944, the bases themselves became isolated. The Allied invasion of Normandy led to rapid advances across France. American forces pushed toward the Atlantic coast, threatening to cut off the submarine ports. In August 1944, the Battle for Brest began. American forces besieged the city for 6 weeks, eventually taking it at a cost of 10,000 casualties. The port was completely destroyed exactly as the Germans intended. If they couldn't hold it, they'd make it useless to the Allies. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle became fortified pockets, holding out long after France was liberated. Nearly 120,000 German soldiers were besieged in these ports. Hitler ordered them defended to the last man. The bases that had been offensive weapons became defensive positions. Workshop equipment that serviced submarines was converted to build tanks and land weapons for infantry fighting desperate defensive battles. The submarines were gone. Most had been sunk. A few escaped to Norway. The bases that were supposed to ensure German naval dominance became isolated fortresses, where soldiers waited for a war that was already over. These are the installations American forces finally reached in May 1945, days after Germany's surrender. When American troops entered Lorient and Saint-Nazaire on May 10th, they found pristine facilities abandoned in order. The Germans had simply walked away, leaving behind every trace of their presence except themselves. The bases weren't ruins. They were preserved specimens of infrastructure that had failed to achieve its purpose. Walking through Cell 5 at Saint-Nazaire today, you can still see original steering posts with numbered markers. Wooden walkways remain on stern platforms. Walls bear markings in marine ink showing German naval symbols. In the underground fuel distribution levels, the smell of diesel persists 80 years later. Massive steel tanks that fed diesel to 20 submarines simultaneously remain intact, their pipes still connected to distribution systems that will never pump fuel again. The transformer rooms still contain French and German electrical equipment with labels showing Motor 1, Motor 2, the connection points where power was distributed throughout the facility. Someone scratched a profile of Winston Churchill into the concrete, Germany's #1 enemy, immortalized by an unknown worker in the heart of a Nazi submarine base. These physical details tell the story more powerfully than any strategic analysis. Every cell, every workshop, every fuel tank, every electrical system represents German confidence that industrial superiority and defensive infrastructure would win the Battle of the Atlantic. The bases were built to service submarines for decades of warfare. They were engineered to withstand any weapon the Allies possessed. They succeeded at both goals. And it meant nothing. The Americans who entered. These bases found them both impressive and irrelevant. The concrete fortresses had survived 6 years of war untouched. The infrastructure was functional. The systems were operational, but there were no submarines to service. The cells were empty. The fuel tanks were unused. The torpedo loading equipment stood idle. The command bunkers were abandoned. The radio towers at Bat-sur-Mer transmitted nothing. The bases at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux remain today as they were in 1945. The French Navy briefly used them after the war, even putting captured German submarines back into service under French flags. But eventually they were abandoned. The concrete fortresses that were supposed to last 1,000 years are slowly deteriorating. Water seeps through cracks, corroding the steel reinforcement inside. The metal skeletons that made these structures impregnable are rusting from within. The Battle of the Atlantic cost 45,000 Allied sailors and 30,000 German submariners their lives. 85% of men who served under Dönitz died in action. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were destroyed. The bases that were supposed to make German submarines invincible became their tombs. Dönitz himself escaped execution at Nuremberg despite being convicted of war crimes for ordering submarines not to rescue survivors from torpedoed ships. The evidence showed rescue provisions were not carried out, and Dönitz ordered they should not be carried out. This made explicit what his strategy had always implied: total war with no mercy, no quarter given, no limits on violence in pursuit of victory. He served 10 years in prison, was released, and lived until 1980. 5,000 people attended his funeral, many of them submarine veterans who still revered him. But Winston Churchill provided the most honest assessment. In his memoirs he wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." That admission, from the man who faced the Luftwaffe's bombing of London, the Wehrmacht's victories across Europe, and the genuine threat of invasion in 1940, tells you everything about what the submarine bases represented. For 3 years Dönitz was winning. The tonnage war was starving Britain. The wolf packs were devastating convoys. The bases were providing operational efficiency that multiplied submarine effectiveness several times over. Britain's food reserves were dwindling. The strategic situation was genuinely desperate, and then it turned. Not because the bases were destroyed. They weren't. Not because submarine production declined. It didn't. But because the Allies broke Enigma, developed better detection technology, closed the air gap, and overwhelmed German submarine effectiveness with industrial production that couldn't be matched. The bases gave Germany every advantage engineering could provide. They were marvels of construction, achieving in months what should have taken years. They provided protection that no Allied weapon could breach. They enabled operational efficiency that kept submarines at sea longer than should have been possible. They represented Nazi Germany's industrial and engineering capability at its peak. None of it was enough, because wars aren't won by concrete fortresses. They're won by breaking codes, sinking submarines faster than they can be replaced, building ships faster than they can be sunk, developing technology that makes yesterday's weapons obsolete, and maintaining industrial and technological superiority throughout sustained campaigns. The submarine bases survive as monuments to defensive engineering. They're impressive structures that accomplished everything they were designed to do. They protected submarines from bombing. They enabled rapid turnaround. They provided complete operational support. And they didn't matter, because Germany lost the intelligence war, lost the technology race, lost the industrial competition, and lost the tonnage war. When American soldiers walked through these bases in 1945, they were walking through installations that had never been defeated. The bases were captured because Germany surrendered, not because the Allies breached them. They remain standing today precisely because they're so difficult to destroy. The 3-meter-thick concrete roofs still resist degradation. The steel reinforcement is corroding, but slowly. These structures might stand for centuries more, but they'll stand empty. The submarines they were built to protect are wrecks scattered across the Atlantic floor. The submariners who operated from these bases are mostly dead, killed in a campaign that achieved nothing. The Wolfpack tactics that made Dönitz famous are historical curiosities. The tonnage warfare doctrine that nearly starved Britain is remembered as a strategy that ultimately failed. The fortresses remain. The fleet is gone. That's the lesson written in concrete at Lorient. Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux. You can build impregnable fortresses and still lose the war. You can create infrastructure that survives anything and still watch your strategy fail. You can engineer solutions to tactical problems and still lose because your enemy solved the strategic ones. American soldiers in 1945 encountered these bases and recognized them for what they were: magnificent engineering in service of a defeated navy. The Germans had built something that would last centuries to protect a submarine fleet that lasted 5 years. The disparity between the permanence of the installations and the brevity of their useful life captures the fundamental failure of Nazi strategic thinking. Germany believed superior engineering and defensive infrastructure could compensate for strategic disadvantages. They were wrong. The bases prove it. Standing empty on the French coast, slowly corroding from within, they're monuments not to German engineering prowess, but to the limits of defensive thinking in modern warfare. Churchill understood this. His famous quote about the U-boat peril being the only thing that frightened him during the war wasn't about the bases. It was about the submarines, the crews, the tactics, the sustained pressure on Atlantic convoys that nearly succeeded in starving Britain into surrender. The bases were tools, the submarines were weapons. And weapons are only effective if the strategy employing them is sound. Donitz's strategy was initially sound. Tonnage warfare would work if submarines could sink ships faster than they could be replaced. Wolfpack tactics would work if coordination could overcome convoy defenses. The bases would work if they could keep submarines operational. For 3 years, everything worked. Britain was being strangled. The Atlantic was becoming a German lake. Victory seemed achievable, but strategy must adapt to enemy countermeasures, and Germany failed to adapt quickly enough. When the Allies broke Enigma, Germany never realized it. When convoy defenses improved, Wolfpack tactics became increasingly costly, but weren't fundamentally revised. When submarine losses spiked, production increased, but tactical doctrine remained largely unchanged. The bases kept servicing submarines that were being sent to sea under increasingly suicidal conditions. By 1944, the bases were processing submarines whose crews knew they were unlikely to survive their patrol. The infrastructure was immaculate. The operational efficiency was maintained. The protective concrete remained impenetrable. But submarines were leaving port to face air patrols they couldn't evade, escorts equipped with radar they couldn't hide from, and sonar that could track them underwater. The bases couldn't solve these problems. They could only watch submarines depart and increasingly fail to return. The human cost was staggering. Beyond the 30,000 German submariners killed, the Battle of the Atlantic claimed 45,000 Allied sailors. Merchant seamen died by the thousands, torpedoed while carrying food and weapons across the Atlantic. French forced laborers built the bases under brutal conditions. French civilians died in Allied bombing raids targeting the ports. Thousands more died in the besieged Atlantic pockets after D-Day, fighting defensive battles around bases that no longer served any strategic purpose. The financial cost was equally immense. The bases required thousands of tons of steel, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of concrete, and specialized equipment sourced from across occupied Europe. The TOT organization mobilized workforce on an unprecedented scale. The submarine construction program consumed resources that might have been allocated to other weapon systems. All of this investment produced infrastructure that remained operational for less than 4 years before becoming strategically irrelevant, and the strategic cost was total defeat. Germany needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic to have any chance of defeating Britain. The bases were supposed to ensure submarine superiority. Instead, they serviced a submarine fleet that was systematically destroyed despite having access to the most sophisticated support infrastructure available. The tonnage war was lost. Britain didn't starve. American supplies continued flowing to Europe and the Soviet Union. The Atlantic remained open. Germany's strategic position became untenable. Walking through these bases today is a surreal experience. Everything is preserved. The steering posts in Cell 5 at Saint-Nazaire, the fuel distribution systems 3 levels underground, the electrical equipment in transformer rooms, the burst chambers and the Fangros roof beams. You can still read the numbered markers showing where submarines docked. You can still see where workers scratched marks into concrete. You can still smell diesel in the fuel storage areas. The bases feel inhabited, as if submarines might return at any moment, but they won't. This is what total defeat looks like. Not destroyed installations, but abandoned ones. Not shattered fortresses, but empty ones. Not bombed ruins, but pristine facilities that no longer have any purpose. The Germans built these bases to last 1,000 years, and they might. But the Reich they were built to serve lasted 12 years, and the submarine fleet they were meant to protect was annihilated in 6. That disparity captures everything about why Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. You can build fortresses that survive anything and still lose the war if your strategy is fundamentally flawed. You can create infrastructure that's genuinely impregnable and still watch your forces destroyed if the enemy solves strategic problems you can't overcome. You can engineer magnificent solutions to tactical challenges and still fail because wars are won by intelligence, technology, production, and adaptation, not by concrete walls. The bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux stand as permanent reminders of this lesson. They're the most impressive military installations Nazi Germany built outside its borders. They represent engineering achievement at the highest level. They accomplished every goal they were designed to achieve. They survive today exactly as they were built, and they're completely irrelevant. Because the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't decided by who built better fortresses. It was decided by who broke codes, developed better weapons, built more ships, and maintained strategic superiority throughout a 6-year campaign. Germany lost on every one of those metrics. The bases couldn't compensate for those losses. They could only watch Germany's submarine fleet be systematically destroyed, despite having access to the finest support infrastructure available. American soldiers entering these bases in 1945 encountered physical proof of this reality. The bases were intact. The infrastructure was functional. The protective systems were operational. Everything worked exactly as designed, and none of it mattered because there were no submarines to service. The empty cells told the story more clearly than any strategic assessment could. Germany had built magnificent fortresses to protect a fleet that no longer existed. This is the devastating irony Dönitz couldn't escape. He stood at Lorient in June 1941, receiving the architectural plans for the completed base, confident. These fortresses would enable submarine dominance of the Atlantic. 4 years later, he was Hitler's designated successor, commanding a nation that no longer existed, defending bases that no longer mattered, protecting submarines that had already been defeated. The bases outlasted the submarines, the fortresses outlasted the fleet, the infrastructure outlasted the strategy, and that's the final lesson. In modern warfare, defensive installations matter less than offensive capabilities, static fortifications matter less than mobile forces, and engineering prowess matters less than strategic vision. Germany had magnificent bases, the Allies had better strategy, the bases remain, the fleet is gone. Churchill's assessment stands as the definitive verdict. The U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. Not because the bases were impressive, though they were. Not because the infrastructure was sophisticated, though it was. But because for 3 years, German submarines were systematically destroying Allied shipping, starving Britain, and threatening to win the war through sustained attrition. The bases facilitated that campaign. They made it possible for a relatively small submarine fleet to maintain pressure far beyond what their numbers suggested. They provided protection, efficiency, and operational support that multiplied German effectiveness. For 3 years they were decisive, strategic assets. Then they became irrelevant. Not because they were destroyed, they weren't. Not because they stopped functioning, they didn't. But because the submarines they serviced were being hunted to extinction by an enemy with better intelligence, better technology, better tactics, and overwhelming industrial superiority. The bases couldn't solve those problems. They could only watch submarines depart for patrols most wouldn't return from. They could only service a shrinking fleet, taking unsustainable casualties. They could only maintain perfect operational readiness for forces that were being systematically destroyed, regardless of how well the bases functioned. This is what American soldiers discovered in 1945. Not hidden underground installations, the bases were never underground. They were massive above-ground structures on the French coast. Not secret facilities. The locations were well known, just impervious to attack. But abandoned fortresses that had survived everything the Allies could throw at them and meant nothing because the war they were built to support had been lost years earlier. The physical evidence of this failure is everywhere in these bases. At Saint-Nazaire, Cell 5 remains in near-perfect condition. The steering posts with their numbered markers still stand exactly where German crews positioned them. The wooden walkways on stern platforms haven't rotted despite 80 years of exposure. The walls still display markings in marine ink, symbols of the Kriegsmarine Transmission Service, notes about equipment positioning, operational reminders scratched by workers who believed these bases would service submarines for decades. 3 levels below ground, the fuel distribution system remains intact. Massive steel tanks stretch from floor to ceiling, their walls still visible, their capacity still staggering. These tanks could hold enough diesel to send 20 submarines to the American coast and back without refueling. The pumps that distributed fuel through pipes to every cell are still connected. The valves that controlled flow still turn. You can trace the entire system from storage to distribution, seeing exactly how German engineers solved the logistical challenge of refueling multiple submarines simultaneously. The electrical systems are equally preserved. Transformer rooms contain equipment labeled Motor 1, Motor 2, with voltage indicators showing 220 and 380 volts. Large electrical boards display connection points where technicians could plug in tools and equipment, switching between French and German standards as needed. The sophistication of these systems becomes clear when you examine them. This wasn't crude infrastructure hastily assembled under wartime pressure. This was precision engineering designed for long-term sustained operations. The burst chambers in the fangrost roof structure are perhaps most impressive. Standing beneath these parallel beams separated by explosion corridors, you get a sense of the engineering ambition involved. Light passes between the beams, creating what one historian described as a cathedral of reinforced concrete. Thousands of cubic meters of concrete surround you, all precisely positioned to absorb and dissipate bomb impacts. The system was never completed. At Saint-Nazaire, it covers only 1/3 of the roof. But what exists demonstrates the lengths Germany went to make these bases invulnerable. And yet, walking through these preserved spaces, the overwhelming feeling is futility. Everything is here. Everything works. Everything was maintained in perfect operational condition right up to the moment Germany surrendered. And it accomplished nothing, because the submarines these systems were built to support are gone. The empty cells are most striking. They were designed to accommodate U-boats of various sizes, Type 7 submarines that formed the backbone of the Atlantic campaign, larger Type 9 boats built for extended patrols, and toward the end, experimental types that never saw significant service. The cells could be flooded or drained based on operational requirements. Submarines could enter, be secured, have the cell pumped dry for hull work if needed, then be reflooded for departure. This flexibility made repair work dramatically faster than traditional dry dock procedures, but the cells stand empty now. Water laps against concrete walls that once secured submarines. The securing posts remain in place, their iron fixtures corroded by decades of saltwater exposure but still structurally sound. These are the physical markers of absence. The infrastructure remains, but the vessels it was built to accommodate are gone. Scattered across the Atlantic floor, sunk by depth charges, aerial bombs, torpedoes from Allied submarines, or simply lost to mechanical failure and the harsh conditions of extended patrols. The command bunkers attached to the bases tell another part of the story. Donitz's headquarters at Karaman included the converted bar, where he displayed tiles showing submarine emblems. Each tile represented a U-boat that passed through Lorient. The collection grew throughout 1941 and 1942 as more submarines were commissioned and sent to the French bases. But after 1943, the rate of new tiles being added slowed dramatically, then stopped. Not because submarines stopped coming to Lorient, but because so many were being sunk that the rate of loss exceeded the rate of new construction. The command bunker itself was built to survive anything. Walls several meters thick, multiple layers of concrete protection, air filtration systems that could sustain operations during gas attacks, communication equipment that could maintain contact with submarines at sea and with German naval headquarters. From this protected position, Donitz coordinated Wolfpack operations, vectoring submarines toward convoys, ordering tactical deployments, managing the entire Atlantic campaign. But command and control infrastructure is only effective if the forces being commanded remain capable of executing orders. By 1943, Donitz was commanding a fleet that was being systematically destroyed. His orders were still being transmitted. Submarines were still attempting to execute them, but the operational effectiveness was collapsing. Wolf packs that should have converged on convoys were being intercepted by escorts who knew exactly where to look. Submarines surfacing to charge batteries were being caught by aircraft that appeared within minutes. Coordinated attacks were being disrupted by convoy defenses that seemed impossibly well prepared. The Germans never understood why. Their confidence in Enigma was so complete that they couldn't conceive of the codes being broken. When operations failed with suspicious frequency, they attributed it to Allied technological advances. Better radar, better sonar, better tactics. They never suspected that every encrypted transmission was being read by the enemy, that their entire strategic picture was known to the Allies in real time, that the coordination that made Wolfpacks effective was giving the British exactly the intelligence needed to counter them. This intelligence failure was catastrophic. The bases could provide perfect operational support. The submarines could be maintained in excellent condition. The crews could be well trained and highly motivated. But if every patrol is being tracked by an enemy who knows your orders before you execute them, operational effectiveness becomes impossible to maintain. The radio transmission station at Bat-sur-Mer exemplifies this vulnerability. 10 giant pylons reaching 180 meters high, connected by 12 kilometers of cables, capable of broadcasting encrypted messages to submarines 80 meters underwater anywhere in the Atlantic. The transmission power was enormous. The range was global. Submarines operating off the American coast could receive orders as clearly as boats patrolling near Britain, but every transmission was intercepted. British listening stations on the coast recorded everything. The signals were forwarded to Bletchley Park, where Turing's team decoded them. By the time a submarine received its orders, British intelligence had already analyzed them and was coordinating responses. Convoys would be rerouted, aircraft would be dispatched, escorts would be positioned. The submarine commander thought he was executing secret orders. The Allies knew exactly what he'd been told to do. This is why the bases ultimately failed to achieve their strategic purpose. They solved tactical problems, protection, efficiency, sustainability, but they couldn't solve the strategic problems that were actually decisive: intelligence compromise, technological inferiority, industrial inadequacy, and tactical inflexibility. The British and Americans understood this perfectly. Churchill's decision to abandon strategic bombing of the bases wasn't surrender. It was strategic clarity. The bases were impressively fortified and nearly impossible to destroy with existing weapons, but destroying them wouldn't win the Battle of the Atlantic. Sinking submarines would, breaking their codes would, building ships faster than U-boats could sink them would. Developing detection technology that made submarines vulnerable would. So that's what the Allies did. They allocated bombing resources to German production facilities, disrupting submarine construction at the source. They targeted German cities, forcing diversion of resources to homeland defense. They hunted submarines at sea with aircraft escorts and improved weapons. They built Liberty ships on assembly lines. They routed convoys based on decoded intercepts. They won the intelligence war, the technology race, and the industrial competition. The bases survived all of this unscathed, and it didn't matter. Admiral Max Horton, commanding Western approaches from Liverpool, understood the nature of the contest. He'd been a submarine commander in World War I, so he knew submarine tactics intimately. Legend has it he saw his battle with Dönitz as a personal golf match where each stroke was a tactical move against his opponent. The metaphor captures the reality. This was a competition between commanders who understood each other's thinking, mirroring each other's moves across the Atlantic. But Horton had advantages Dönitz lacked. He could read Dönitz's signals. He commanded aircraft that could patrol the entire Atlantic. He had access to technological developments that were making submarines increasingly vulnerable. He had convoy routing flexibility that could avoid U-boat concentrations. Most critically, he had time. The longer the war lasted, the stronger the Allied position became. More ships, more aircraft, better weapons, improved tactics. Momentum was shifting decisively. Dönitz recognized this shift, but couldn't counter it effectively. In May 1943, losing 41 submarines in a single month forced him to withdraw U-boats temporarily from the North Atlantic. This admission of defeat was dressed up as tactical repositioning, but everyone understood what it meant. The happy hunting ground had become a killing field. Wolfpack tactics were no longer viable against improved convoy defenses. The tonnage war was being lost. Donitz tried various tactical adjustments. He equipped submarines with better anti-aircraft weapons to fight back against air patrols. He developed snorkel systems that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, reducing surface time. He dispersed submarine operations to reduce radio traffic. He pushed for new submarine designs that could operate at higher speeds underwater. None of these adjustments addressed the fundamental problems. Better anti-aircraft weapons didn't help if aircraft could spot submarines before they could respond. Snorkels reduced vulnerability but didn't eliminate it. Dispersed operations meant less effective coordination. New submarine designs would take years to develop and deploy in significant numbers. The strategic situation was deteriorating faster than tactical adjustments could compensate for. The bases became increasingly irrelevant in this context. They still provided excellent support. Submarines still used them for repairs, refueling, and rearming, but the submarines being serviced were going to sea under increasingly hopeless conditions. Crews knew their odds of survival were diminishing with each patrol. The bases could prepare submarines perfectly for combat, but they couldn't make those submarines survive contact with an enemy that held every strategic advantage. German submariners' diaries and letters from this period are haunting. They describe men who understood they were likely to die, going through the motions of military routine while contemplating their fate. Some wrote final letters to family members before departing on patrol. Others tried to maintain morale through dark humor about their situation. Many simply resigned themselves to death as an inevitable consequence of service. The bases witnessed this psychological deterioration. Submariners returning from patrol were traumatized by experiences at sea, constant depth charge attacks, near misses from aerial bombs, watching other submarines destroyed, spending days submerged while escorts hunted them. The men who came back were the lucky survivors. Many submarines simply never returned, their fates unknown until after the war when loss records could be compiled. By 1944, average submarine survival was below 3 patrols. This meant most crews were killed before completing their third operational deployment. The training pipeline couldn't keep pace with these losses. Experienced commanders were being killed and replaced by less experienced ones. Crew quality was declining as veteran submariners died and replacements had less training time. The submarine force was deteriorating in quality, even as tactical conditions worsened. The bases couldn't solve these problems. They could only watch the spiral continue. Perfect infrastructure supporting a dying fleet. Immaculate facilities servicing submarines that were being systematically destroyed. Engineers maintaining systems in flawless condition for forces that were ceasing to exist as effective combat units. After D-Day, the base's strategic irrelevance became physical isolation. The invasion of Normandy led to rapid Allied advances across France. By August 1944, American forces were threatening the Atlantic coast. The submarine bases, which had been offensive platforms, became defensive positions. Submarines that could escape fled to Norway. Those remaining in port were trapped as Allied forces closed in. Brest fell after brutal siege. American forces took horrific casualties assaulting fortified positions, but eventually overwhelmed German defenders. The submarine base survived the battle intact. Its concrete walls absorbed artillery and aerial bombardment without significant damage. But the city around it was devastated, and the port facilities were systematically destroyed by retreating Germans. The base remained operational in a technical sense, but it had no strategic value. There were no submarines to service, no convoys to hunt, no strategic purpose to serve. Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle became isolated pockets. Hitler ordered these positions held to the last man, declaring them fortresses that would tie down Allied forces. Nearly 120,000 German soldiers were besieged in these ports, cut off from the rest of Germany, surrounded by increasingly hostile French resistance fighters and Allied forces. The submarine base personnel found themselves reassigned to infantry duties. Men trained to maintain diesel engines and electrical systems were handed rifles and told to defend perimeter positions. Workshop equipment meant for servicing U-boats was converted to produce land weapons. The bases became factories producing mines, grenades, and light weapons for defensive battles. This transformation was complete by early 1945. The bases no longer served any naval function. They were simply fortified positions holding out because orders required it, waiting for a war everyone knew was already lost. Submarines weren't coming back. The Atlantic campaign was over, but the bases had to be defended because retreat was forbidden. The defenders held out until Germany surrendered. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire were liberated on May 10, 1945, 2 days after the official surrender took effect. When American and French forces entered, they found bases in pristine condition. No sabotage, no destruction. Equipment remained functional. Systems were operational. The Germans had simply walked away, leaving behind a complete submarine support infrastructure that would never be used again. This orderly abandonment is telling. The bases hadn't been defeated. They hadn't been breached. They hadn't been rendered non-functional by Allied action. They were surrendered because Germany lost the war, not because the bases themselves failed. In a narrow technical sense, the bases succeeded at everything they were designed to do. They protected submarines from bombing. They provided efficient service. They maintained operational capability throughout the war. Their failure was strategic, not tactical. They couldn't compensate for intelligence compromise, technological inferiority, industrial inadequacy, and tactical inflexibility. No amount of concrete, no matter how thick, could solve those problems. The bases represented Germany's belief that superior engineering could overcome strategic disadvantages. History proved that belief wrong. The French Navy took control of the bases after liberation. They briefly operated some captured German submarines from these facilities, flying the French tricolor instead of the Kriegsmarine ensign. This period was short-lived. The submarines were outdated, the facilities oversized for peacetime needs, and the strategic situation had changed completely. By the 1950s, the bases were largely abandoned, preserved primarily because they were too difficult to demolish. This is how they remain today. Walking through Lorient or Saint-Nazaire, you encounter installations frozen in time. The cells stand exactly as they were in 1945. The fuel systems remain connected. The electrical equipment stays in place. The concrete walls show no significant degradation despite 80 years of exposure to Atlantic weather. The bases are surviving better than anyone anticipated, but surviving without purpose. Monuments to a campaign that failed despite access to infrastructure that succeeded. Tourists and historians visit these bases now, trying to understand what they represented. The scale is immediately impressive. Standing in a cell designed to hold a U-boat, you get a visceral sense of the engineering involved. The ceiling stretches high overhead, necessary to accommodate submarine conning towers. The width accommodates the full beam of the largest U-boats. The length allows submarines to be maneuvered into position for service. But the emotional impact comes from the emptiness. These spaces were built to be occupied, to have submarines present, to be working facilities humming with activity. Instead, they're silent. Water laps against walls. Footsteps echo in empty cells. The infrastructure that was supposed to enable German naval dominance sits unused, slowly corroding from within as steel reinforcement rusts. The educational value is significant. These bases are physical proof of what happened in the Battle of the Atlantic. Students can walk through the same spaces German submariners occupied. They can see the systems that supported submarine operations. They can understand the scale of Germany's industrial commitment to submarine warfare. The bases make abstract historical concepts concrete, literally and figuratively, but the primary lesson is about strategic failure. The bases demonstrate that impressive infrastructure can't compensate for fundamental strategic disadvantages. Germany built magnificent fortresses that survived everything the Allies threw at them. Those fortresses serviced a submarine fleet that was annihilated despite having access to the best support infrastructure available. The infrastructure survived, the fleet didn't. That disparity contains the entire story of why Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Donitz's post-war fate adds a coda to this story. After serving as Hitler's designated successor for 3 weeks, he was arrested and tried at Nuremberg. The charges against him focused not on losing the Battle of the Atlantic, military defeat isn't a war crime, but on his orders regarding survivors of torpedoed ships. The evidence was damning. Donitz had explicitly ordered submarines not to rescue survivors from ships they torpedoed. His reasoning was tactical, submarines surfacing to pick up. Survivors were vulnerable to counterattack, but the effect was murderous. Thousands of merchant seamen died in the water after their ships were sunk, watching submarines that could have rescued them sail away instead. The court convicted Donitz of war crimes. The verdict stated clearly that rescue provisions were not carried out and that Donitz ordered they should not be carried out. This formalized what submarine warfare had always been: industrial killing with no mercy, no quarter, no limits. The tonnage war required maximum efficiency, and mercy was inefficient. Donitz served 10 years in Spandau prison, was released in 1956, and lived quietly until 1980. He spent his final decades defending his conduct, insisting he'd been a naval officer following orders, that submarine warfare wasn't inherently criminal, that his men fought honorably. Some veterans agreed, attending his funeral to honor a commander they still revered decades after the war ended. But others saw him more clearly, the architect of a campaign that killed tens of thousands on both sides, who ordered submarines to show no mercy, who sent 30,000 men to die in a losing battle, who built an empire of concrete fortresses that stand empty today because the fleet they were built to protect was destroyed. Churchill's final assessment stands as the definitive verdict. His memoirs contain the famous line, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This wasn't hyperbole. For 3 years, German submarines were genuinely close to achieving strategic victory through sustained attrition. Britain's food reserves were dwindling. Merchant ship losses exceeded production. The tonnage war was being won by Germany. The bases were central to this near victory. Without them, U-boats operating from German ports would have been far less effective. The bases provided the operational range, sustainability, and efficiency that made Wolfpack tactics viable. They multiplied German submarine effectiveness several times over. For 3 years, they were decisive strategic assets that nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. Then they became irrelevant. The shift happened gradually, then suddenly. Allied countermeasures accumulated: broken codes, better radar, improved weapons, long-range aircraft, overwhelming production. Each countermeasure reduced submarine effectiveness marginally. Together they created conditions where submarines couldn't survive at sea, regardless of how well the bases supported them. This is the ultimate lesson of the Atlantic submarine bases. Strategic success requires solving the right problems. Germany solved tactical problems: how to protect submarines in port, how to service them efficiently, how to maintain high operational tempo. These are real problems, and the bases solved them brilliantly. But the strategic problems were different. How to prevent the enemy from reading your communications, how to counter technological developments that make your weapons obsolete, how to match enemy industrial production, how to adapt tactics faster than the enemy develops counters. Germany failed to solve these problems. The bases couldn't compensate for those failures. Walking through these installations today, you're confronted with physical evidence of this reality. Every system worked, every structure survived, every design element succeeded at its intended purpose. And it meant nothing, because the strategic contest was being decided by factors the bases couldn't influence. The empty cells at Saint-Nazaire capture this perfectly. Cell 5, preserved in nearly original condition, contains everything needed to service a U-boat. The steering posts are positioned correctly, the fuel connections are functional, the electrical systems work, the structural integrity is perfect, everything is ready. There's just no submarine to service, and there never will be again. This is what American soldiers discovered in 1945. Not hidden underground installations filled with secret weapons. That's fiction. But abandoned above-ground fortresses on the French Atlantic coast, pristine and functional and completely irrelevant because the submarines they were built to protect had been hunted to extinction years earlier. The bases stand today as they stood in 1945, empty fortresses on the French coast, slowly corroding from within as their steel reinforcement rusts, eventually destined to collapse under their own weight as the metal that gives them strength deteriorates. They might last centuries. They were built to last a millennium, but the Reich they served lasted 12 years, and the submarine fleet they protected was annihilated in 6. That disparity between the permanence of the fortresses and the brief existence of the fleet they served captures everything about why Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. You can build fortresses that survive anything. You can create infrastructure that functions perfectly. You can solve tactical problems with engineering brilliance, and you can still lose the war if your enemy solves the strategic problems you can't overcome. The Atlantic submarine bases are monuments to this lesson. Impressive, sophisticated, remarkably preserved examples of military engineering that accomplished nothing because they solved the wrong problems. They protected submarines from bombs, but couldn't protect them from broken codes, superior technology, overwhelming production, and better strategy. The fortresses remain, the fleet is gone, the bases survived, the campaign failed. That's the story written in concrete at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux. And it's the story American soldiers discovered in 1945 when they entered installations that had never been defeated but no longer mattered. Fortresses built to last forever, protecting a fleet that ceased to exist. Monuments to a strategy that failed despite access to the finest infrastructure engineering could provide.